Hi, everybody. Good morning and welcome back. We have 2 sessions left. We are in the home stretch, and I'd like to welcome our panel up here. We've got a New York State approach to clean energy, really a case study exploring how innovative solutions are and broader stakeholder engagement, investments, and integration are all really helping to realize these state decarbonization goals. Today, talking about that, we first will hear a virtual presentation from Kevin Hale, Director of Utility Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at NYSERDA. And joining us on our stage here today, thank you, is Emily Nelson, Executive Vice President of New York ISO, Phil Toya, President of NYPA Development at NYPA, and Brian Gemmel, Chief Clean Energy Development Officer at National Grid. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to kick it over to Kevin. Welcome, Kevin. Kevin, you are joining us virtually. Thank you. In the room here, we have about 75 to 85 really leaders in the industry. So you can't see all of us here, but we thank you for joining us, and I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, great. And good morning, everybody. And can you hear me okay? Just want to make sure I check this. Everything's okay? Okay. So yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning with you virtually. And I just want to say a really big, huge thanks to the GridWise Alliance for dedicating a session to some of the amazing work that we're doing here in New York. I can't cover all of it. There are a lot of great things that we're doing, but given the limited time that I have here for my remarks, and really the fact that we have some really brilliant, high-powered panelists behind me, I'm going to try to be brief and really just highlight some of the key initiatives in New York that are really going to have probably the most profound impacts on our energy system and utility infrastructure. So New York is really leading the way in changing its energy landscape. And we're doing that to achieve what the state has as some of the nation-leading climate goals and targets that we're looking to achieve, and ultimately get ourselves to economy-wide decarbonization. Now, to some people, that change is probably happening too fast. But for many of us, especially those at NYSERDA, our partners at Department of Public Service and alike, it's not happening fast enough. The imperative is fairly significant for us to change and adjust. But I, for one, I'm pleased to be working in a state and for a governor who recognizes both the imperative to address climate change, but also our governor and really all of our stakeholders in New York. We take very seriously the opportunities that come with this commitment. And those opportunities, manifest themselves from an economic development perspective, all the way to a community development perspective as well. But ultimately, in New York State, we can't do this alone. We're part of a regional market. We're part of a big global movement. And we need public and private sectors to be working with us and alongside us to drive the change that we need. And a lot of that thinking is exactly what's ingrained in our legislation that came into effect in 2019, called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which I'll call the Climate Act. So that act requires significant shifts in our electric generation. It requires significant shifts in the way we're going to use our electricity and our energy sources, and significant shifts in the way our customers interact with the grid. So reaching 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040, which is really just around the corner when you think about it, is going to mean a lot. It's going to mean a lot for all of us. But right now in New York, we're in the beginning stages of integrating large amounts of renewable energy required to meet our targets. And we're really thinking hard and looking at integrating those resources in a way that's going to benefit the grid and drive beneficial electrification activities in transportation and buildings. Now, the Climate Act is pretty significant. It established a 22-member Climate Action Council, which our president at NYSERDA, Dorian Harris, co-chairs with the Commissioner of Department of Environmental Conservation. The council is charged with some significant work. They're charged with drafting and adopting a scoping plan, which really is going to be a roadmap to achieve the Climate Act's goals. I'm happy to report that the council is progressing as scheduled. And right now, they're preparing for a draft scoping plan to be available for the public review and comment towards the end of this month. And then during 2022, the council is going to use that time to get public feedback and begin some final deliberations to prepare the final report and deliver that to the governor and the legislature in 2023. So they have a lot of work in front of them. Some of the targets I just want to highlight that we're working with in New York State are on this slide. and I'll just hit on a few of those. But I think the point here is the Climate Action Council is underway. It's very important, all of that work, but we've not remained idle. We have been moving very swiftly to implement some major clean energy initiatives and programs towards these targets. So by 2025, we're looking at 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar in the state and 185 TBT reduction in end-use energy consumption in buildings and industry. By 2030, we're aiming for 70% electricity from renewables and 3,000 megawatts of storage. And by 2025, we're striving for 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind. And all of these goals are in pursuit of the Climate Act's 85% reduction in GHGs by 2050 target. What's important to note, too, about the Climate Act and really where New York is focusing its attention and priorities is that act requires a minimum of 35% of the benefits from our clean energy investments to accrue to disadvantaged communities. And we really have an expectation that's outlined in that law as well that it'll be more than that, approaching 40%. And we take that seriously. This is a broad-based goal across EE programs, across housing, workforce development, pollution reduction, transportation, economic development, and alike. And really, what does this mean? It means in New York, we're laser focused on creating an inclusive energy system for the future. Now, unlike the energy system of the past, what New York is doing is moving to ensure that the energy system of the future is built around, to include, and really to the benefit of these underserved and disadvantaged communities that really have been left aside with the energy system that we've had in the past. Just transitioning a little bit to some of the activities that we have underway and some of the major initiatives that we have underway in New York. From a large-scale renewable perspective, we've got a very good base of progress and activity to point to. We have an impressive portfolio of about 100 new large-scale projects. Those are onshore wind, hydroelectric facilities, solar, you name it. That portfolio is about 12,000 megawatts of new renewable capacity, enough power for more than about 6.2 million households in New York. And really, from an economic development and investment perspective, we estimate about $33 billion will be invested in the state of New York. And that private investment is going to bring a lot of new jobs, a lot of new property taxes, and a lot of activity to local communities in more than 30 counties across the state of New York. Offshore wind is a very big area that we've gotten a lot of great attention for. And the team has done a lot of great work to get us where we are and have accelerated quite rapidly in the past couple of years. Right now, we have 5 offshore wind projects that are in active development that'll supply power to New York, worth about 4,300 megawatts. So that's the largest pipeline in the nation. And that pipeline represents about 50% of the capacity we need for our 2035 offshore wind targets. Together, these 5 projects are expected to create about 6,800 jobs, great paying clean energy jobs in the state of New York, and spur about $12 billion of combined economic activity. Now, much of that economic activity is going to be in different aspects of the supply chain, but here I'm going to highlight just some of the areas, and that's really around the port investments that we've been doing and making in New York from the state along with our project development partners. In October, we were at the Port of Queens, a little bit south of Albany, where we announced an $86 million supply chain manufacturing contract for the Sunrise Wind Project. And that project is expected to bring to this port facility about 230 jobs in the capital region and Western New York. So that's a very large investment that we're looking at in the Capital District area. Now, the Port of Albany, not too far away from Queens, is going to be the site of the nation's first wind tower manufacturing facility. And South Brooklyn Marine Terminal is going to be the home to an offshore wind staging facility as well as an O&M hub. So these are just some of the first steps that New York is looking to take to capitalize on the offshore wind supply chain and all that related activity. And we look forward to continuing that work as we issue additional requests for proposals next year after the federal government completes its new round of leasing around the New York Bight. A really innovative approach that New York has taken to combat climate change can be seen in Tier 4, and that's part of our large-scale renewables clean energy standard program. And during Climate Week, Governor Hochul announced a very significant advancement of critical infrastructure projects that are going to deliver new transmission assets to the state of New York. And what's innovative about this, these transmission projects have partnered with upstate wind, solar, and hydropower to deliver that clean power directly to the city of New York to reduce its reliance on fossil fuels. And that's going to really improve the air quality and public health in many of the disadvantaged communities in downstate, and really push the meter going the other way so that we're importing less dirty power from the PJM grid. These two recommended projects, they've just been filed to the Public Service Commission a matter of days ago. It's the Clear Path New York project and the Champlain Hudson Power Express project. Upon approval, these projects are going to be the first of their kind projects where we're combining transmission and renewable energy generation in a way that's going to deliver public health benefits and significant jobs. Approximately 10,000 family-sustaining jobs are going to be delivered as a result of these projects. So there's a lot of activity that's going on, not only onshore, offshore, but also with our transmission system planning activity. In fact, many of this activity I just talked about probably keeps a lot of the people that are on the panel up at night, the folks at the ISO, the folks at National Grid, the folks at Con Ed, Long Island Power Authority, and a lot of different partners. But the state has taken some pretty significant steps around transmission planning to support a lot of that clean energy development. So not too long ago, in January of this year, it was a little while ago, the Department of Public Service issued a comprehensive report on the power grid. And that looked at transmission and distribution needs, not only to accommodate the 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind, but also look longer term at 70 by 30 and 100% zero emissions by 2040. The findings of the studies are public, they're out there. There's a lot of good news in there, and a lot of that is the current transmission projects that are already underway are positioning the grid really well to achieve the 70 by 30 targets. We do see some opportunities to accelerate a lot of that activity, especially as we issue additional solicitations in the future. But we think we're pretty well positioned to meet those needs. In downstate, the study shows that the bulk transmission system on Long Island needs some expansion and upgrading to accommodate offshore wind. So over the next 10 to 15 years, that study has outlined a path and some projects that can take us further along with Long Island and New York City to accommodate offshore winds and potentially push some of that power north as well. Now, the studies also identified there's an opportunity to coordinate with storage technologies and grid optimization technologies, and that's going to be a priority as we look to the future as well. So it's clear that we need to evolve the New York State grid over time as we see changes in the resource mix, as we see changes in building electrification and energy efficiency and alike. In fact, as we look a little bit further down, away from the infrastructure side of things and look more in the buildings area, we must decarbonize our building stock in New York. And I think a lot of people believe there are ways to do that. The technologies exist. And it is a very critical piece of the climate puzzle, but it's potentially one of the most challenging. If you think about the thousands of buildings that we have in New York City, for example, how do we even get them engaged, those building owners, to a point where they can think about capital planning in a way that's going to benefit their tenants, but also benefit the climate and the economy? So we have millions of those buildings spread throughout the state. In fact, 70% of them, and they're very old, were constructed before the Energy Code was established. And many of those buildings are not designed to be efficient. In fact, we estimate that almost every single building in New York will need to have some sort of upgrade to achieve our climate goals. So the challenge is pretty big. To put that into perspective, if we look at our laws and where we need to be in New York State, we need to be decarbonizing on the order of 200,000 buildings a year from now through mid-century. Now, this slide gives you a very nice overview of what we mean when we think about a building that is completely decarbonized, a building that is interacting with the grid and pursuing more of a community approach to delivering and meeting our energy needs. We see that building with flexible loads. We see that building looking at resiliency and really more longer-term design with attention to embodied carbon and refrigerants. And that's fantastic. This is kind of the vision that we have going forward. But really, to get to the scale that we need, especially in New York, we need to move away from a building by building model to a block by block and a community by community model. And thankfully, we have time to do that. We've got quite a bit of a runway, but we need to make sure that we're doing this and paying attention to customers and communities along the way and making this relatable to them. We've got a good base of activity in decarbonizing our buildings already underway. We have about $6.8 billion that's being invested between NYSERDA and the utilities to support high efficiency, all electric heating and cooling technologies and shell measures and alike. But we know it's a long road. We've got a lot to do. We've got a great amount of resources that we're putting forward already to decarbonize our building stock. And we look forward to keep pushing that envelope. Now, our building decarbonization efforts are not standing alone. They're complemented by about $1 billion investments to ramp up clean transportation infrastructure. So we're really thinking about what that means and how that interacts with our grid as well. And the last component that I want to highlight is our workforce development needs in New York. We estimate that we'll have about 40,000 New Yorkers trained in the next 10 years or so through about $120 million in programs that NYSERDA is going to administer from a workforce development perspective. So significant opportunities there around workforce development and a major challenge, especially related to the building decarbonization effort. I think just in closing, a few points to make, and you'll hear probably some of the panelists touch on these. But all the efforts here in New York are advancing really a fundamental change in the way load interacts with the grid, the way our projects interact with the grid, and the type of technologies that we're going to be looking to rely on in the future as we get to a decarbonized system. As you look to the future, our clean energy investments in New York are going to actually help us support private sector growth, and we're going to leverage billions of dollars for the economy, creating thousands of new family-sustaining jobs. As we look to do this work and enact our ambitious goals, NYSERDA welcomes the opportunity to work with the New York ISO, National Grid, our other utility partners, the power producers, transmission developers, and others in the private sector. As I mentioned earlier, it's going to take all of us working together, the private sector, the public sector, and everything in between. We've got a lot of great work ahead of us, but I'm excited. I work for a phenomenal organization, and I think the folks that are behind me on this panel are really up for the challenge, and we look forward to continuing to work with them. So thank you for this opportunity to provide the opening remarks for this panel, and I look forward to this discussion that follows. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. This is Karen Whalen, the CEO of GridWise, and I had a quick question for you because I know it might be difficult to have a conversation with you remotely and the three here. Can I ask you to talk a little bit about residential geothermal? Because I feel like New York is the only state where it's actually really viable, and that's kind of in addition to storage, is like the firm resource behind DER that's out there.
Sure. So I think you mean residential ground source, or are we talking ground source and air source?
A great thermal program.
Yeah. So through Clean Heat New York, the state, NYSERDA, and the utilities have made significant investments towards clean heating and cooling. And that program has got a significant amount of funding that's going towards ground source and air source heat pumps. NYSERDA is complementing those incentives with a lot of market development work. We're working with the utilities around outreach, education, workforce development, and NYSERDA is actually advancing some pretty significant amount of pilots in the community geothermal space as well, where we want to get some of those new demos and pilots and proof points out that can really help kind of scale that new technology into different areas of the community. So great question, phenomenal resource. It's something that is of high priority to the state and our investor-owned utilities, and we're really pushing forward with that.
Kevin. Kevin, thank you for that presentation and for setting the stage here. I'm going to pass it to our panelists here, and I'm going to go to Emily first. And what you're going to hear is just a few responses to all of these goals and these ambitious visions of how it's going to get done. And then we're going to go to the audience, and we're going to have a good conversation here. And maybe we'll ask all the hard questions to our three panelists here on stage, but I hope you can stay with us and join us, Kevin. So, Emily, I'll pass it to you.
GridWise for putting on such an excellent conference. Especially, I am appreciative that I'm on a panel where I don't need to rap. I try to save that for my kids at home. And I don't have to eat hot sauce because I am woefully unprepared to do that. So much happier to talk about decarbonization goals in New York. So I think that part of what we want to convey during this panel is not only the policy objectives that have been codified for New York, but some of the actions that are being taken to try to realize that vision in the state. I work for the New York Independent System Operator. Our mission is to ensure power system reliability and competitive markets for New York in a clean energy future. So if you think traditionally about what wholesale markets were intended to bring, It was reliable power at the least cost. And I think for a couple of decades, that promise has been realized in New York. Very understandably, objectives change, and in New York, in the country, universally, what's on the forefront of many people's minds is decarbonization. How do we transform these systems to really be the grid, the systems that we need for tomorrow? And that creates some challenges. I think one of the most critical things and one of the most important things that I can do as part of the New York ISO is try to bring some of the information to bear on what will be necessary to fulfill our core responsibilities of continuing to have a reliable power grid so it can be built upon, and also thinking through some of the investment, the innovation that's necessary to also make this transformation cost effective is really using the competitive markets to the maximum extent possible to realize this vision. We produce a number of studies. So one of our core functions is planning for the bulk power system. That supports our operation function. We have control centers. We operate the bulk power system in collaboration with partners. And in a number of these studies, whether they're produced by the NISO or by others, we are starting to provide a better view of the challenges that we need to rise and meet. And the intent of that is not to say that we can't make progress or that these objectives are unrealizable, but really to make sure we're working toward them and that we're solving them. One of the studies that we recently released just last week is our comprehensive reliability plan. And I just would like to spend a moment talking about some of the challenges we see on the grid. Certainly, if you think about the nature of the New York power system, and if you operate in different regions, I think that all regions have some challenges and you just need to understand them so you can manage them. But if you think of New York in particular, a lot of our zero emission resources are located upstate. And of course, it's obvious, our load is really driven by the metropolitan area of New York City. And when you consider building out renewable technologies in and around such a dense urban area, there's challenges with respect to space and permitting and all of these things. So how do you transform the profile of the energy usage of New York, which looking at 2020, 77% of energy needs in New York City was really fulfilled by fossil resources, to the objectives that we just talked through. 70% renewable energy serving New York by 2030 and a zero emission grid by 2040. And that is to enable really a broader decarbonization of the economy across all sectors, transportation, building, et cetera. Well, of course, you need to figure out ways to bring that clean energy to those load centers. One part of that solution at scale is really thinking through transmission build out. So we have several projects that are underway in New York that the ISO has had a role in. It's called our public policy transmission process. And this will include several projects to date. We have Western New York, which is bringing more clean power from upstate and the Ontario regions across the state. We have something known as AC transmission, which is bringing power further across the state and into the southeastern portion of New York. And right now we're working through something called the Long Island Public Policy Transmission Need, which is an opportunity for developers to really submit project ideas. We'll go through an evaluation process after determining if they're viable. And that is to enable offshore wind, which is another part of the solution to meet this challenge of serving load in New York. If you think about some of the issues with building at scale renewable resources in an urban area, of course, the untapped potential here in this country is looking to the offshore grid and offshore opportunity. So as part of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, we have goals in New York to integrate 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind. So the other area I'd like to just spend a moment on is thinking about more on the supply side. So I mentioned offshore wind. There's something particular about managing a power grid that's a nut we need to crack, if you will. Certainly, if we think about building up our renewable capability, that's wonderful. That's going to help us get to the 70 by 30 goal. But the other part of the CLCPA is phasing out our fossil base. And in order to continue to have a reliable power grid, we really need new technologies to come to bear in order to make sure that every second of every day we are able to connect and serve the customers that need power. And so when we think about technologies that are certainly at the forefront today, you think about lithium-ion batteries, and they tend to have a 4-hour capability when you think about a wholesale application. And what we're trying to convey in addition, as far as a need is concerned, is that we need to meet the daily cycle of serving load. So if you think about our profile, our load ramps up in the morning, eases off midday, and then there's another ramp in the evening hours. As we build out solar, certainly that profile is going to change. So we see that battery storage, for example, can help shift that renewable production across the day. But we also see a need on a weekly cycle, a seasonal cycle. And so there's a tremendous amount of investment that is needed on the grid. And that's where I'd like to just spend a moment on the role of markets. So one of the things that we focused on in the ISO in the past years, but this is really core to our mission, is building out new capability within the competitive markets so technologies can compete. So having a full set of storage rules where storage resources can come in. We talked earlier today about distributed energy resources, and next year we are going to implement a full capability for distributed energy resources to aggregate and then participate in our wholesale markets. And we're also looking at where we need to remove barriers. So something that's been very contentious amongst the ISOs and RTOs are rules that are known as mitigation rules, where when a resource enters, it's assessed for its economic viability, and depending on if it's receiving outside funding, it can be subject to an offer floor. So in New York, we believe about creating solutions for the state that will really be sustainable. And just recently, our stakeholder process passed by 82% rules to transform our mitigation. This was across sectors, which will really allow resources to come in fully in our energy markets and in our capacity markets, which will be critical for all technologies to compete. So those are some of the things we're doing. I'm happy to engage more as we talk, and I'll pass it over to Brian.
Good morning, and on behalf of National Grid, thank you for this invitation to GridWise. So just building on what you've heard from Kevin and from Emily, I'm going to give the perspective of one of the transmission owners, of which National Grid is one in the state, and you know how all that's trickled down into what we're doing. And you've heard about for me the proactivity that New York is really engaging in right now. Kevin gave that overview. How do we boil that down? So the state set out that 2030 target. And against the generation that they're planning for 2040, they went through a very broad stakeholder process, allocated where the renewables from the offshore and upstate solar and wind are likely to be located. We got ahead of the curve and started doing proactive transmission planning around those scenarios. So right now, we've been very active on what do we need to do to enable in our backyard and upstate the facilitation of 10 gigawatts of renewables that are in the queues, they're in planning, and we are now moving ahead. We've made our filing on November 8th to the Public Service Commission of that first phase of projects that are going to help enable the penetration of renewables proactively. So we're now building on the work that will take us to 30. There's a lot of work going on between now and the end of next calendar year to identify all those roadmaps. So again, all of the transmission owners with the ISO, through NYSERDA, the Public Service Commission are all working proactively in order to make that happen. So we've talked about the challenge of aging infrastructure and workforce development, and that's a big anxiety for us all. Who's going to be able to deliver this work? So we're working with all forums to promote New York for construction, and other roles are going to be necessary to do that. So that's just where it was one utility. We're enabling that through transmission plannings. The other underlying thing that we have an aging infrastructure. Upstate New York, we joke about Edison watched the erection of some of the assets that are still in service today. So it's vast, it's a big network. Kevin talked about the underserved community. So this will really enable electrification and bring economic growth to these states as well as jobs. So, but we want to make it affordable for all. We want to be resilient to the grid, but facilitate this electrification. Emily also teed up some of the projects. She talked of Western, the AC transmission. You saw Kevin's chart with some other in the tier 4s. But really, we're in a unique opportunity where the state is really being that proactive in the legislation. The transition that's going to come from National Grid over to NYPA just in a minute is that there was another form of public policy, an extension of that, of how the state would expedite transmission being built to enable that. So National Grid and New York Power Authority had already been looking. Emily talked about kind of the east-west, and then from Albany south. We were also looking in that vast northern region of the country where it's very rich in wind and solar opportunities, of how would we bolster the network. So we came up with the idea, thinking there was going to be public policy to the next project, and you have to get ahead of that because it takes a long time to develop those. So we'd spend some time, but then there was a legislation change that gave New York Power Authority specific authority in the state to look to develop projects that were no-brainers, that could be done expeditiously, and that formed which is now called Smart Path Connect. National Grid is thrilled to be partnering. It was selected under a competitive process with New York Power Authority for that, and we're working on a project now to provide an incremental 1 gigawatt of transfer capacity coming from north to south that will plug into the projects that Emily outlaid. So with that, New York is a great case study. That's why I think this panel is today showcasing with multi-stakeholder, everyone's engagement, how do we get ahead of the curve? And we're going to be layering in electrification, transportation, buildings, all that's coming. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Phil to talk more from NYPA's perspective.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you for having us. This is a great opportunity to talk about the unique position of New York. And just having spent almost 30 years in the New York utility business power system, it's just great to see, as everybody, Kevin, Emily, and Brian talked about, just the development that's going on in New York. I mean, just from Western New York, Northern New York, all the way down through Central New York and into the Southeastern area. I'll talk a little bit about NYPA's role in a minute here, but just about these projects. I mean, as was pointed out, it's just a tremendous amount of development and looking at proactively addressing these. As Kevin talked about, we have the CLCPA, Climate Act. We also have the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act. There is an acronym for that, but it's just impossible to say. But that's what Brian was talking about, where we talk about the priority transmission projects, looking at accelerating those projects to get the renewables to the market, to help with the electrification and getting the renewables from where they are. As I said, the time I've spent in New York and looking at the development, it's just a great opportunity when you look at utilizing existing assets and all of these projects, whether it's utilizing existing right-of-way, upgrading existing assets. I mean, Brian talked about the Smart Path Connect. We also have Smart Path. NYPA, we're celebrating our 90th anniversary this year. Many people look at NYPA when we look at the hydro out at Niagara Falls, and we look at hydro along the St. Lawrence River. But NYPA's first asset actually was a transmission, and that's our Smart Path project, where we're taking a line that's 80 years old, double circuit lines, and upgrading and rebuilding them to modern standards, as well as to serve a new and unique purpose, where we're looking at getting those renewables to the market, where it used to be looking at serving load. And the Smart Path Connect is just a continuation of that project to get that extra 1 gigawatt of renewables to downstate, central New York and downstate. NYPA is also a participant in the Clean Path project that Kevin mentioned. That project is looking at integrating 3,800 megawatts of renewables in upstate, along with a high voltage DC line. And that project there is really unique. And again, it's utilizing existing right-of-way for a majority of the line. We're also looking at utilizing our Blenheim-Gilboa pump storage facility to help with the intermittency of the renewables to optimize the utilization of the line and get those renewables into New York City. So I think one of the things here, again, is just taking the existing assets and trying to optimize them and get additional capacity out of them, whether it's our hydro pump storage facility or existing rights-of-way. If you look at the transmission development in New York, again, I believe the majority of them are along existing rights-of-way or upgrade of existing facilities. And this has been going on. We look at Marcy South Series compensation that was put in a few years ago. And again, as was pointed out, trying to be proactive and address problems before they become problems. That project with other utilities, there was other work that was done trying to get additional capacity energy to downstate New York in anticipation of some other retirements. And as far as NYPA, we have our new strategic vision, our Vision 2030. So I touched upon a little bit of this, but looking at preserving the value of a hydropower. Hydro is a significant asset in New York, and trying to bring those facilities up to current standards, current technologies, looking at digitization. We also are looking at a significant growth of our transmission development business or transmission business through our development aspects. We're also looking at how do we decarbonize fossil assets. We're doing a pilot project now on hydrogen at one of our power plants, seeing how that plays out. So we're really across the board. And then lastly, just looking at customer and the electrification piece, trying to work with our customers, looking at energy storage, distributed resources as well to help them meet their goals and to help them decarbonize as well. So I'll turn it back over. We'll go from there.
Thank you. It's a great case study, and I appreciate all these perspectives of how things are working, and we just started to touch on things that might be barriers or what's needed. We heard a little bit about that, so I want to dive a little bit more into those kind of questions, but I also want to make sure that we open it up for the audience here. I think if today is anything, it's been a really good two-way flow of discussion. And so please, if you have questions here to dig down a little bit deeper into any of the visions or any of the stories that we've heard here, please just raise your hand and we'll come around. My first question here is just from what we heard yesterday from California ISO, and there was a lot of discussion around planning, and maybe this is for Emily, but I think everyone could have a perspective here if needed, is when we talk about perfect modeling, or we talk about modeling and how it relates to distributed energy, where does that fit in, and who is kind of what's needed to make sure that New York has perfect modeling, if you will, as that's kind of the goal for California?
I'm not sure perfect and modeling fit together. The reality is what we are trying to prepare for is a lot of unknowns. And so part of what we see as really the prudent path is getting yourself prepared for those unknowns. So a lot of what we've started integrating into our modeling work is preparing for different scenarios when you think about basically how things might unfold, what's happening with the load, what's happening on the supply side, what's going to happen with new resources coming in and exiting, bringing it down deeper into modeling and specifically pertaining to distributed energy resources. we certainly try, and it depends from a modeling perspective if we're talking about the planning horizon or the operations horizon. But we try on the planning side to do what I just said, anticipate how things might vary in the future. On the operations side, in New York, a lot of what our focus has been is making sure that we have the information in the control centers to provide situational awareness. So taking the time to invest upfront on the metering that's needed, the information and data streams into the control center. And this requires different techniques, and there's new techniques coming out all the time. But the bottom line is we need to synthesize that information so that our control room operators have an understanding what's going on the grid, and things can be balanced around the knowns and the unknowns. So certainly there's a lot of opportunity to improve modeling techniques further, and I think we're probably just at the beginning of that.
Rapid fire question, and we've heard now from policy and then markets and technology and deployment. As we talk about partnership here in the state, we've got 3 other ISOs here. There's a lot of state utilities. There's a bunch of other states here represented virtually as well. What made this work? What's leading it? What's, in your guys' mind, what is kind of driving the factor? What's the main point of kind of success? What would you point to here?
I think there's alignment from starting from the governor and the ambition of the state and everybody on board. So everybody's followed in, and we're having the discussions they've started, and they're going to continue of what it's going to take to achieve the 2040 ambition. So it's a collaborative process. Everyone's had their voice through that, and there's been proactive action. So it started from the vision, like any company, the state, and just making it happen through partnerships, through funding, through the appropriate means. So it was a top-down, and everybody getting on board with a democratic state.
How do you, we heard visions here of like 2035, 2040, 2050, there's Vision 2030. How do you guys put those together in states where there might be maybe not that alignment? How do you align all of those together?
Well, as Brian indicated, I think it starts the CLCPA. I mean, it's legislation, it's the law. So we've gotten past how do we do this? What do we do? We have to do this now. And as was pointed out, I think it's just a very proactive approach and looking at all options. As Brian indicated, I mean, the public-private partnerships, NYPA's involvement in these projects, whether we're working with National Grid on Clean Path project, we're working with Energy Re and Invenergy. On one of the AC proceeding cases, we're working with LS Power. So it's just, I think everybody has just put aside the whole, it's not going to work. How do we make this work? We're focused on it and really just looking at, stimulating from a market perspective, as well as NYSERDA's solicitations and other aspects. Just everybody's just pulling, working together and pulling together to make it happen.
And if I could add to that, you asked how did we make this happen? We are at the very beginning of a hard journey, and our most significant challenges are still before us. So what we've made happen at this point is we've started, right? We really are seeing some of the action that is aligned with the law, the policy goals, whatever you want to call it. And that's some of the time pressure. We need to hit certain objectives by a date certain, and there is investment that is going into achieving these objectives. Some of it coming through, a lot of it coming through public means, some of it coming through competitive markets. All of this needs to come together. But in 10 years, we can see how we've done at having 70% renewable energy serving New York. So I just don't want to oversell that we have a lot of hard work, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that so that we keep making progress like we're doing today.
I have a hard question that we're going to ask everyone here as you're traveling back after this event. We heard from John Rhodes yesterday talking about the climate goals from administration, and he said that they plan to deliver a reliable, resilient, low-cost, zero-carbon grid, fully decarbonized grid, in a just transition by 2035. Is that possible?
Anything is possible. Anything's possible. But I think that one of the things that can hold us back is we take it to the last hard issue or some of the final decisions which we don't yet know how to solve. So it does take a little bit of a leap of faith that some of these unknowns we're going to figure out. I would also offer that between where we sit today and that point, there's a lot of room for progress. So there's a little bit of, I think what you're hearing from this panel is let's get on with it and let's start making some of that progress.
Any other comments on most important barrier to get there? Or first
This
barrier?
is going to be a critical decade, as Emily said. That to get that 70 by 30, the steel in the ground, the cables, the substations, all of that moving, and then there's the narrative around the electric vehicle, highway, fleets. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, and the renewables a lot what we've talked about thus far has just been in the renewables piece. We've yet to really have the debates now starting around the load, because what's the load going to look like with the decarbonisation on top of that?
I think the other point there is that, a stake was planted, right? And New York's been aggressive in it as far as the 2030 goal and 2040 goal. So I think once that's done, and as Emily pointed out, there's a lot of unknowns, but that's not stopping us from moving forward. We're moving forward with what we have now, and not letting those the last mile issues, if you will, hold us up. We're moving forward, and everybody is focused on that and progressing towards that goal.
And the tough conversations are happening, right? No one's shy for having those in these collaborative sessions. That the important things are being discussed of how we will achieve those goals.
We see you, Kevin. Final kind of thoughts or reactions to what you've heard here, or any reaction here?
No, this has been a really great discussion. I just think kind of looking in here remotely and listening to the conversation, I hear the urgency in Emily's voice, the energy from the entire panel, the passion, and the vision that I've heard from previous panels when I was able to listen in yesterday. We feel pretty confident that the base of progress we have in New York is positioning us well. And I think the comments of, not getting hung up on that last mile is important. I think continual stakeholder engagement and partnerships is really what's going to get us there. That drives the ideas, it brings the innovation forward. Because right now it's not a matter of what, right? We have a law, it's everything, right? It's decarbonization of our system. We can talk about whether it's 5,000 heat pumps in a community or 10,000, it's all of them. Things are going to evolve. So I think success is going to really rely on a continued collaboration. It's going to rely on execution, and it's going to rely on learning. And making sure that there's going to be some risks that we're going to have to take. But fortunately, we have a NYSERDA in New York. We can kind of help offset some of those risks. And we do a lot of great work working with partners like National Grid, the New York ISO, and NYPA to really bring forward different perspectives and different ideas. So a lot of it's going to lie on us from an execution perspective and a learning perspective, and just evolving and not being kind of dug into certain perspectives or things that may have gotten us there today are not going to be the things that we're going to have to rely on tomorrow. So again, just from my perspective, thank you for the opportunity to highlight New York and bring together some really great speakers and panelists.
Really interesting movie last night called Convoy, and it's kind of old, but I was told to watch it, and it was really a movie about technology connecting people. I think we talked a lot about technology here, and that's kind of my takeaway from it. So we're glad that technology was able to connect us here with Kevin and hear this complete story. And so I just want to thank all of our speakers here, and thank everybody for joining us for this presentation. Thank you.